Network in the search bar, and you put that there. It'll take you to the website, and you'll see if you click on coaches, 50, almost close to 50 people that we have now that we've trained that are providing mental health services to people all over the world. Now, anybody can receive services. We make no exceptions. You can be, a Seventh-day Adventist, you can be a Muslim, you can be a witch, you can be a warlock, we'll take you no matter what. But the providers are all Seventh-day Adventist. And the reason we do that is because we have a niche market, what I would call a niche market, where we know that there are so many Adventists that want an Adventist provider or an Adventist coach or counselor who understands their worldview, understands what they believe, so that they don't have to try to explain it to some person going, what? The person already knows and supports their worldview. And so we knew there was a need for that. I needed it when I was younger. We knew that other people needed it, and it turned out to be right. We get referrals every day from literally all over the world. And so God has really worked powerfully. Let me show you a little bit about how we function. So this is what I'm calling the Abide community. We have very much a community and discipleship model of ministry. That means that we believe in the power of a community to help move people forward in their mental health journey. In other words, we don't put all of the stress on the individual coach or counselor. That is part of it, but we also have this larger community where we have support groups, we have group workshops, like this anxiety and depression one, and we have a Friday night Bible study that started at the beginning of COVID that continues to today. So we have all these things going on, and people connect with one another in a very authentic and real place where they can talk about their mental health struggles and kind of what's going on inside of them. And I find that when people can talk about what's going on inside of themselves, is like Velcro. It opens them up and they can form really healthy, bonded relationships. So there's a real fellowship in Abide Network, and that's what I call the Abide community. And we have all these different events. We have trainings, we have workshops, we have groups and coaching that all kind of feed into the community. We also have what I would call the Abide Network, and the Abide Network are the actual providers, the people that lead out in these different services that are giving. But we have a discipleship model where we train people and they can become part of the network. Because what I found is that I would help people through counseling or coaching, and then they would get to a place where they needed to help others in order to continue their recovery journey. And so I would train them through this one-day intensive training and then a certification process so that they would learn basic skills of how to help people with their mental health, and then they would come into the network and provide services through the network to other people. So it's really working well. People are getting healthy, and we are able to really minister to people through that. Now, so far, are there any questions? I just sort of blah, blah, blah that out. So I don't know if you have any questions about what I just shared. But if you do, okay, yeah. No, it's some are professional. The majority, I would say it's a third to two-thirds. Two-thirds would be the paraprofessionals. Her question was, are all 50 of the providers professional counselors? So about a third are professional counselors and about two-thirds are paraprofessional coaches. So, and we call all that we do, we call it mental health coaching for legal reasons. But we do have professional counselors doing it. So, any other questions? I know that was a lot of stuff that I just shared. Okay, just write it down. If you want to ask later, that's fine. Let's talk about anxiety and depression relief. Let's get into kind of a summary or kind of an overview of what I'm going to be presenting over the next 4 days. So this meeting today is on just defining anxiety and depression. What are they? What's wrong when something goes wrong in our mood or our anxiety levels? What is wrong? Let's define it, because in order to confine a problem, we have to first define it. So let's define it. And then the next meeting tomorrow, Tuesday, we're going to be looking at what I call nature hacks, or maybe nature habits and hacks. Things we can do with our lifestyle that will help increase our brain health. Because after all, we experience these disorders in the context of our brain, right? And so the healthier our brain is, the healthier our thoughts and our minds will be, and the healthier our bodies are, the healthier our brains will be, because our brains are physical organs, and everything is connected, amen? So we're going to talk about that on Tuesday, and then on Wednesday, we're going to talk about managing the thought life and how our thoughts impact our mood. There's a very intimate connection between the way we think and the way we feel. And then on Thursday, we're going to talk about some issues having to do with relationships, connecting to one another, because so much of healing is coming into our own, into the purpose for which God created us, which is to love and be loved. So you can't really separate being mentally healthy from healthy relationships. So that's what I'm going to talk about on Thursday. All right, so let's look at what's wrong with us, what's happening when we struggle with anxiety and depression. These are very common conditions. Let's define anxiety. A dictionary definition is a feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease, typically about an imminent event or something with an uncertain outcome. But a clinical definition of anxiety is a mental health disorder characterized by feelings of worry or fear that are strong enough to interfere with one's daily activities. That's the marker that sort of distinguishes what you might call normal anxiety or normal depression from clinical anxiety or depression, is that it affects your ability to function. In order to be diagnosed, you have to lose functionality in your relationships, in your work life, your ability to eat, sleep, take care of yourself. When you start slippage in that area, then you probably are diagnosable. And not that you want to be diagnosed, but you know what I mean. So let's look at some of the physiology behind anxiety. We talk about fight, flight, or freeze. How many of you have heard those expressions? We've kind of added the freeze recently. It's called tonic immobility, because for some people, when they encounter a threat, they become paralyzed. Not literally necessarily, but they sort of go into the zone, so to speak. So anyway, fight, flight, and freeze are three of the typical reactions that human beings have to some kind of perceived threat. And there are a number of different physiologic characteristics of each one of those. For instance, the freeze effect is typically characterized by numbness, heart pounding, a sense of dread, pale skin, holding your breath. The flight response is typically, restless legs, fidgeting, feeling trapped, anxiety, wide eyes, being very tense. And then the fight response is tautness, hyperventilation, defensive stance, blood to the muscles, and blood away from the organs. So there are different things that happen to us physiologically with each of those respective responses. And of course, there's going to be overlap between them. So let's look a little bit at the brain here. We experience anxiety in the limbic system of the brain, the real pretty inner part of the brain. That kind of boring pink part is called the cerebral cortex, and that's the rational, thinking, logical part of the brain. And the emotional part of the brain is very colorful, just like emotions are very colorful, and like the illustrations are colorful. And there are a number of different organs that are kind of packed into that limbic system. But what basically happens in anxiety is that emotional part of the brain gets hyper-aroused. And I'm simplifying for the sake of making it simple, oversimplifying a bit. But that emotional part of the brain is going to get hyper-aroused, and it's actually going to draw energy away from the cerebral cortex, the rational part of the brain. And I just kind of stopped for a second there because this slide normally has writing on it. Anyway, let's talk about the nervous system for a little bit. You have two basic parts of the nervous system, the somatic and the autonomic. The somatic part of function, I should say, of your nervous system is governed by conscious thought. The autonomic function of the nervous system is governed by unconscious reactions and mechanisms. Okay, so let me illustrate, okay? So, and this is good because we just ate. So stand up for a minute and get far enough away from the person you're next to where you don't hit them. And move your arm like this. Just move your arm up and down, up and down. That is your somatic nervous system making your arm move, okay? So what you're going to do is keep doing that and do it faster and faster. What happens to your heart and your breathing as you're moving that arm faster and faster? It increases, that's right. But you're not going, oh, I need to make my heart beat faster, and oh, I need to make my breathing go faster. You're just naturally doing that because it's being controlled by the autonomic system. Think automatic. You automatically start breathing harder, and you automatically start Your heart starts beating faster, and you can sit down now. So you have those two branches, somatic, autonomic. Then there are two parts of the autonomic part of the nervous system, and that's what we're dealing with when we're dealing with anxiety, is that autonomic system not behaving the way we want it to. My little brother ran the Ironman about 10 years ago, and he was not a young man at the time, and he's also kind of ectomorphic, built a bit like me, kind of skinny, started training for the Ironman. How many of you know what the Ironman is? It's this very, very grueling marathon that involves swimming and biking and running, and you just have to train for it, and it's just crazy. So he was training for it, and he started losing weight, which happens often for people that are thin. So he went on steroids to keep from losing weight. But he didn't just go on steroids, because he doesn't do anything halfway. He went on steroids. And he lived in a foreign country where you can get as many as you want, and he took heavy doses of steroids. So after the race, he went off of the medication, and he crashed. He's never been depressed in his life, but he all of a sudden became extremely anxious and depressed and had all kinds of mental health issues as a result of it. And then the doctors gave him, he was in a foreign country where they have a little more liberal policy on these medications. The doctors gave him a great big bottle of Ativan, or one of these benzodiazepine type sedative drugs. And those are highly addictive, so he became addicted to that. And then he tried to wean himself off of that, and then he went on Valium, and then he tried to wean himself off of that, and he went on. Anyway, he went through this whole process. And he got to the place where, and I experienced this, he would be warm on one part of his body and cold on another, because his nervous system was so dysregulated. And he couldn't get any help for it medically. Finally found a doctor that said, I know what you have. It's called dysautonomia, as in dysregulation of the autonomic nervous system, the unconscious governing of how our nervous system works. And yours isn't working anymore because you messed with all these drugs. And so what he did was he gave him a muscle relaxer, which put him in very deep sleep every night, and it regenerated the deep REM sleep regenerated his nervous system, and he was able to come out of it. But that's all to say that your autonomic nervous system does a lot for you, a lot. And you don't even thank it. But you should thank it right now, because it does a lot for you. And when it stops working, you realize, wow, I should be more grateful. And it stops working for you to some degree when you develop anxiety, because all of a sudden you're getting super anxious and aroused and, activating that sympathetic response when you don't really need it. And then the parasympathetic, so the sympathetic is the arousal response, and the parasympathetic is shutting down. So if you got to sleep, that nervous system has to shut down, right? And you'd be very low function of the parasympathetic. You're going to be really low functioning until you get into REM sleep, and then it gets jacked up again. But you're asleep by then, so it's fine. So basically, you need that autonomic nervous system to work for you, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic response, and they have to coordinate each other and go back and forth. We don't even think about it, but when it stops working, then you're really in trouble. And it, to some degree, stops working for you in anxiety. So let's look at some of the symptoms or subtypes of anxiety. And these are actually in the order in which we see them develop. Specific phobia is the most common anxiety disorder. That means an extraordinary fear, a disproportionate. And that word disproportionate is an important word. It's what we often see with anxiety disorders generally, is there's a disproportionate response. It's not that you should not be afraid at all, it's that it's way more than is really called for. And so that's what we see with specific phobia is, a spider is like halfway across the room, and it's this big, and it's not a poisonous spider, and the person is like crawling the walls. That's called a specific phobia. And then social anxiety disorder is right about the same level of prevalence as specific phobia, and that's simply being unnerved by or anxious in social situations. Post-traumatic stress disorder is related to anxiety, but it's not exactly the same. And then generalized anxiety disorder is when someone just becomes anxious and afraid of pretty much everything, and it can be very, very limiting in terms of your life and what you can accomplish, what you can do. Panic disorder has to do with panic attacks. How many know what I'm talking about when I say a panic attack? where you feel like you are dying. That's what a panic attack feels like. And you are not dying, but you feel like you are dying. You feel like you're having a heart attack. And it's a very, very rapid spike of anxiety response over a very short period of time, and it typically resolves within an hour. So it's there and gone within a fairly short period of time. But then what happens is people become anxious about having an anxiety or a panic attack. They become worried that they're going to have another one, and they'll start limiting themselves. Like if they're triggered by driving over bridges, they'll stop driving over bridges. They're triggered by elevators, they'll stop going into elevators. They'll start limiting the things that they expose themselves to because they're so afraid of having one of these panic attacks. And then you can actually start to over-interpret physical symptoms. So you have a little bit of low blood sugar and you start shaking, when that happens, and you're hungry and you haven't eaten in a while. But a person with a panic disorder will sometimes think, oh, I'm about to have a panic attack. And they'll have a panic attack about having a panic attack when they're not even having a panic attack. I'm serious. So that can lead to agoraphobia, where you're afraid of closed-in spaces, or other situations where you may develop a panic attack. All right, let's look at depression. Let's just get a dictionary and a clinical definition of depression. So a dictionary definition is the state of feeling sad. Simple. But it gets a little more complicated when you give a clinical definition. So that's a mood disorder marked especially by sadness, inactivity, difficulty in thinking and concentration, a significant increase or decrease in appetite, sleeping more or sleeping less than usual, feelings of dejection and hopelessness, and sometimes suicidal tendencies. Wow. Heavy. So that's depression. There is such a thing as a depressed brain. These conditions will affect the way not only we feel, but the way we function. So let's look at some of the brain changes that come about with depression. You're going to find that parts of the brain are going to experience a reduction in volume, including the hippocampus. You have like these little, it's an organ that's on both sides of your brain. There's one on each side. Have you ever seen it? How many of you have seen a hippocampus? You think it would look like a hippopotamus? But it actually doesn't. It's real skinny, and it looks like a seahorse. And it's on both sides of your brain. So they misnamed it, didn't they? But it actually means, hippocampus means seahorse in some other language. I can't remember which one. So I'll let it go. So anyway, you're going to see reduction in volume in that hippocampus. You're going to see sometimes reduction in volume in the prefrontal cortex, the rational thinking, exercising your will, conscious thought part of the brain. The thalamus, the insula can also be impacted. The insula is an interesting little organ. It's right behind your ear, and it is very involved in what we call interoceptive awareness. Do you know what that is? Interoceptive awareness is basically physical self-awareness, where you can guess your own, when you're getting hungry or tired. Have you ever heard the expression HALT? Hungry, angry, lonely, or tired? This is what they teach young women that are struggling with eating disorders and cutting in this type of thing. They call it HALT. Whenever you're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, HALT and take care of that, because these girls don't know how to read their own body signals. So let me demonstrate the insula. Stand up again. I'm making you do a lot of things because I don't want you to fall asleep. Stand up again, and let's just balance on one foot there. And if you wipe out, it's not my fault. Okay? And just balance on that one foot. See, that's kind of hard, isn't it? If you shut your eyes right now, you'd just totally tip over. Don't do it. Okay, balance on the other foot. That is also activating your insula. It somehow balance, and also you can sit down. The ability to read body signals are both insula-related activities. And this is why when young girls start having trouble with anxiety or reading their body signals and need to raise their awareness, they will do Tai Chi with them and different kinds of exercises that involve balance, you see, because they're trying to build that insula function. So all of those parts can be impacted by depression. You can also see increased volume in the amygdala. How many people know what the amygdala is? The amygdala is kind of the fear part of your brain that gets hyper aroused when you're anxious. And it's like the fear encoding part of the brain. You're going to see an increase in volume in that part of the brain. In other words, you kind of develop this hyper arousal of the emotional part of your brain when you're dealing with depression. And then sometimes you're going to see brain inflammation. Now, there are a number of mood disorders. Let's look at them one by one. These are the ones that you find in the diagnostic manual. And you know, these diagnostic categories can be helpful, but they're also not perfect, and they don't describe everything we see, but it gives you kind of an idea. So the most common mood disorder is major depressive disorder. That requires at least 2 weeks of extremely low mood with various effects in your ability to function that I described previously. You have to have at least 2 weeks of that to be diagnosed with major depressive disorder, and it has to be fairly severe and significant. But then there's something called persistent depressive disorder, which is a lower level of depression over a longer period of time. So it's kind of depression light in a way. But what we find is that people with this second category tend to respond to antidepressants less because they've had it for so long. It tends to be kind of built into their personality, and it's harder to get them out of it. By the way, antidepressants tend to work more effectively with the more severe forms of depression. So just a random thought. Substance abuse depressive disorder, postpartum depression. How many of you know about that? How many of you have experienced postpartum? I didn't get depressed. I got a little melancholic, I would say, but I wasn't super depressed. Premenstrual dysphoric disorder. How many of you have a tough time with PMS? Don't raise your hand. I did. I used to. Why does it take 6 women with PMS to screw in a light bulb? It just does. Okay. And then, what's that? Are you going to say something? Yeah, that would be, you know, whenever you're dealing with symptoms, mental health symptoms, you have to find out if people are on substances. And you know what? And thank you for asking that. I also check for prescription substances, because what I find is that often depression, anxiety, these various symptoms are a symptom of, or a potential side effect of that medication.
Yes, exactly.
What's that?
What about people who have come off, they were alcoholics and they're no longer, or they were drug abusers and they're no longer, and have that depressiveness because you're no longer in that lifestyle, no longer using, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Turn a whole 180,
Uh-huh.
but up here doesn't always turn a 180.
Yeah. That's a very good point. And you know, in addiction, you're going to actually change your brain function and structure and chemistry. And getting off of the drug is great, whatever the substance is, but then you've got to deal with your thought life as well and the things that led you into the addiction in the first place.
Is that part of the substance abuse too?
Yeah, I would say so. That, yeah, it could be. It could be. I think more what they mean is when people are on substances and they have symptoms that come from that, but I don't doubt that what you're saying is true. Entirely possible. And then bipolar. How many of you have heard of bipolar? Okay, we have 3 basic types: bipolar 1, bipolar 2, and cyclothymic disorder. Basically, cyclothymic is just a mild form of bipolar, and bipolar 1 is bipolar with mania and depression, and bipolar 2 is bipolar with hypomania, or what's called low mania and depression. So basically, I think it's a spectrum where you have more severe forms over here and less severe forms over here. But each person is different, and it's going to manifest itself differently depending on the person. All right, so let's look at some of the similarities and differences between anxiety and depression, because they're very connected. When I think back on the period of my life where I was struggling with a lot of symptoms, I would say that I was kind of dealing with both, and sometimes it was hard for me to know which one it was. You know, I noticed that when I have to fly out in the morning on a plane, it's rather nerve-wracking to do that, and you feel like you're a criminal anymore in an airport because of the way they look at you and pass you through all these scrutinies and security and everything. It's just nerve-wracking, right? Especially at the Orlando airport. And so it's nerve-wracking flying, and I might forget something, and I'm a woman, and I have all kinds of accoutrements that keep me together, and I might forget one of them, and it's just And I'm all by myself in the big, bad world. So anyway, it's just nerve-wracking. And the night before, I have to get up really early to get on a plane. I'll start getting anxious, right? But it will be like this huge, sort of river of woes that come over me, and I'm thinking about the worst things that have happened in my whole life, and it sort of taps into the central nervous system of all my neurotic tendencies, because my amygdala is stimulated and my limbic system is getting hyper aroused, and then I feel kind of both depressed and anxious. So they're connected. I've experienced it where I'm not sure which one it is. It kind of is both. So there's some similarities, but there's some differences. So here's the similarities. Both of them have distress, involve neurotransmitters, and lead people often toward withdrawal and isolation. When people what happens is when we become distressed internally, it's so hard to be around other people because they don't know what's going on inside you, and what's going on inside you is so intense that you feel like you're not really connected to other people. So what I do with my clients is I encourage them to admit to people how they're doing. When we say, "How are you?" what is the polite thing to say? Fine. But is that always the truth? So it doesn't mean you have to go, "Oh, I'm doing terrible, please help me, I'm desperate," and freak the person out, make them wish they'd never asked you. But what you can do, and I think appropriately, is say, "Look, I'm dealing with some internal distress right now because I'm having some anxiety, but pray for me. I'll get through it. I'll be all right, but just pray for me." That way you've given them a little bit of an idea of what's going on with you. You haven't lied, and you're coming out of isolation. You're being honest with people. But that's typically not what we do. Typically we pull back from people, and we have this intense internal suffering that nobody knows about because we know how to do this. So one of the things we do at the Abide Network, by the way, is we try to create an environment where people can be honest. Now, there's a price you pay for that, because there's some people that are constantly in a bad way, and they can be very draining, and they can take over, meetings. And so we have to have limits. You can talk for 2 minutes, and that's it, because it can bring the whole group down sometimes. But I think in the long run, it's better to run that risk and have an environment in churches where people can be honest. We hear stories of people taking their lives that were deeply depressed, pastors, believers, church members, functioning church members taking their lives or going on for years with depression. Nobody knew what was going on because we didn't have an environment where we could be honest about that. We need to change that and create healthy structures and ways that people can share and ways of getting help for people. Amen? Okay, so that withdrawal and isolation is a big part of it, but here's some of the differences between depression and anxiety. Depression is more involved in regret of the past, whereas anxiety is more about fear of the future. Depression tends to be characterized by hypoarousal. People are kind of sedate, and they talk slow, and they're kind of just wound down. And anxiety tends to be characterized by hyperarousal. People are more, torqued, we might say. Depression, people tend to be under-responsive. Anxiety, people tend to be over-responsive. So there's some differences, but there's some samenesses. What about the prevalence? These are the two big hitters. These are the two things that someone in clinical practice sees on a day-to-day basis. If you leave out substance abuse disorders, this is how mental health diagnoses look. The mood disorders are a big cluster, and the anxiety disorders are an even bigger cluster. Globally, about 30% of people will have an anxiety disorder at some point in their lifetime. Globally, about 30% of people will have depression at some point in their lifetime. That's 30 and 30. Now, there's going to be some overlap, but even if you overlap them, that's going to be about 50% of people that are going to have one or the other or both of these disorders at some point in their lifetime. That's, you're in good company. If you've experienced anxiety and depression, you're not alone. Amen? So let's look at some more stats on the burden of disease. Mental health disorders are everywhere. In 2017, the World Health Organization said that depression was the leading cause of disability in the world. greater than heart disease, greater than cancer, greater than stroke. About 1/3 of people have anxiety. Depression and anxiety comprise the majority of mental health problems. So you can see this is a big issue. Let's look at some more facts here. 18% of adults in the U.S. have a mental health condition. 56% of those adults do not receive treatment. More than half of adults in the United States, which is a wealthy, affluent world where we have lots of professionals treating lots of people, but more than half of people with these disorders are not getting treatment. And that tells me that there's a work we can do. Maybe not full-on clinical practice, because not everybody has the time or the money or whatever to become a licensed professional. But can't we do mental health the way we do physical health? We have cooking classes and nutrition classes, and we train people how to take care of their physical health in a non-professional layperson context. Why can't we do something similar with mental health as long as we're not outside of our scope of practice? Amen? Amen. All right, and that's why we're doing this thing right here today. Okay, so 50% of those adults do not receive treatment. Over 1.7 million youth with major depressive disorder do not receive treatment. That's enough to fill every Major League Baseball stadium in the U.S. twice. That's a lot of people. I want to tell you about an interesting guy. And you'll see where my heart is at with this whole idea of training lay workers to help people with mental health. Because you know, when we help other people, we help ourselves. We need to create a helper environment in the church. I remember when this came to me, guys. I was in the UK. I was doing a training on how to help people with mental health. And I had the whole congregation, like a group of people like this, split into twos and use coaching techniques with each other, helping, with distorted thoughts and some techniques I'd showed them. And I looked out over the congregation with people helping each other, and I said, this is what is missing. Instead of when people walk in the door, you try to figure out what you can judge, or if they're really fully lining up with Adventism or whatever you're doing, or only thinking about indoctrinating people. And I love our message, and I believe in formal evangelism. I do. But I think if we looked at people a little differently when they walk in the door and said, how can I help this person? How can I help meet their needs? And we approached it that way, we would find many more people open. Because what's happening with evangelism is we're having this fact dump event, and we dump all these facts on people, and it's all new and they're all excited about the facts. But I'll tell you what, the research says if they don't connect socially, they're going to be out within a very short period of time, chances are. So we also need to cultivate a helper culture. Mark Finley called it friendship evangelism. I'm just taking it a little further and saying we need to learn how to help one another where the rubber meets the road. And for so many people, they can learn about the three angels' message and the mark of the beast and all that stuff and still have unresolved depression. So we need to become articulate in that as well and create that helper culture in the church. So I want to tell you about this guy, Dixon Shabanda. He was from Zimbabwe, and he was one of only 12 psychiatrists in the entire country of Zimbabwe. And he had a client that lived a couple of hours away, and she was depressed. And she killed herself. She committed suicide. He found out about it, and he found out that the reason she did it is because she couldn't afford, well, she was depressed, but the reason she didn't come see him is because she couldn't afford the bus fare, because he was 2 hours away. There weren't enough people to help these people. And he started thinking, we've got to find a way to meet the mental health crisis in our country, to meet the mental health need in our country. And we're not going to do it through formally trained, licensed professionals. There just aren't enough of us. So what can we do? What resource are we overlooking? And he went through the villages, and he noticed that there were lots and lots of grandmothers. Let's look at this. Oh my goodness, you don't have the picture up here? Oh well. Oh, there they are, good. Lots of grandmothers. The women would outlive the men. And they would just be hanging around the village with wisdom and compassion and lots of life experience. No grandchildren, no children around anymore. Maybe a few grandchildren, but just, not a lot to do. And he said, that's our wasted resource right there. And he started training. I believe in old people, man. I think our church is so potentially powerful because, not in spite of the old folks, us seniors, but because of us, because we have life experience and wisdom and compassion. Some things get better. The outer man wastes away, amen? But the inner man is renewed day by day. So some things get better with age, and we need to capitalize that. Well, that's what he did. He said, these grandmothers are going to waste, man. They could provide a needed service, and they trained them in some simple, ground-level mental health management measures, and they set up what they called a friendship bench ministry. They would put these benches in the villages, and the grandmother would sit there. I love this story. And the people would come and sit with the grandmother on the bench, and she would use those techniques with them. And they did follow-up research, and they found that the grandmothers did just as well for their clients as the professionals were doing. Can you say amen? Amen. We need more. We need more people that are able to help one another. So what causes anxiety and depression? Well, there are a number of different theories. One, of course, involves neurotransmitters. What is the neurotransmitter that is most involved with our mood? Does anybody know? Serotonin, that's right. You would think it would just be a matter of raising our serotonin level, but they've actually done that by giving people serotonin, and it doesn't work. So we're not sure exactly why these serotonin reuptake inhibitor drugs work, but they do increase circulating serotonin. We do know serotonin is involved in mood and anxiety. So neurotransmitters is one theory, circadian rhythms is another one. It's very important that our bodies are in sync with the rhythms of the earth. We're much healthier and happier when we're that way. Sunlight exposure is very important. I'll be talking about that tomorrow. Pretty much every one of my clients over the last 15 years who has worked nights has had more struggles with anxiety and depression, I think, because of the working nights. So I believe the circadian rhythms have something to do with it. Neural circuits are another theory, that there's connections in the brain that need to be built in the case of someone dealing with anxiety and depression. The hippocampus, those little seahorses, is involved with anxiety and depression. We see that those organs tend to reduce in volume over long term when there's high levels of stress, and that can produce depression. And then also trauma history can be a predictor of depression. And there are 1,000 other contributors. It's a very complex disorder. But here's something that I think is very pointed. And this is a man named Stephen Diamond, who is a psychologist. He said this. He said, depression's roots are, from my own clinical observation, more commonly basically psychological than biochemical, though one clearly affects the other. What came first? Brain chemistry issues or our mood problems? What came first, the chicken or the egg? Well, it's kind of hard to tell, isn't it? But he thinks that at the core of depression are these psychological habits, you might say. One more clearly affects the other. Often at the very heart of depression is repressed hatred, anger, rage, resentment, abandonment, betrayal, discouragement, unresolved grief, meaninglessness, nihilism, loss of faith. Without aggressively attacking this psychological, spiritual, and emotional core or heart of depression, it cannot be permanently dispatched. I'll be addressing those things this week. I want to talk a little bit about why we get depressed and anxious in terms of nature and nurture. How many of you have heard or read, is it nature or nurture kind of questions? And is it not true that our genetics and our environment growing up contribute to who we become? Yeah, it's true. But what nature and nurture do is they create a disposition towards something. There's another facet that contributes to what we become, and that's our choice. See, the fact that you had a bad upbringing and you have some genetic setbacks does not determine your ultimate destiny. Are you not thankful for that, guys? Are you not grateful to Jesus that the things that were outside of your control, you know, your parents and the kind of home, you have no control over that. Aren't you thankful that the things that are outside of your control don't determine who you become? You still have options, even though you have setbacks. Now, you have to wrestle sometimes mightily with the disposition that your inherited factors gave you, that dysfunctional home growing up or that abusive home or your genetics. You have to wrestle mightily with those things, don't you? But ultimately, with the power of Jesus, You can win over them. I was set up by genetics to be depressed. I had trauma as a young person. I lived in a critical home growing up. There were lots of things that contributed to me, that were outside of my control, that contributed to me being depressed. But ultimately, God put some choices in front of me and said, you can choose better things. And through making those healthy choices, you can experience improvement in your mood. And by the grace of God, that's what happened. So let's look at treatment just briefly here in closing. How are anxiety and depression treated? I use basically a two-pronged approach, dealing with the psyche, the mind of the person, their thought life, their habits, their relationship patterns, their history, their processing of events in their lives, all of that. And that's done generally through talk or verbalizing of those things. And then typically the classic treatment is to then give them medication, the most common being the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRI drugs, and other medications. So typically people will get individual counseling, group counseling, and be put on medication. Now, some of us don't want to go on medication, right? There are alternatives. They take a little more effort, a little more focus, but you can do lifestyle measures, I'll be talking about tomorrow, that will improve your brain chemistry similarly to the way those serotonin reuptake inhibitor drugs change your brain chemistry and lift your mood. So that's the good news. The bad news is it takes a little more effort, but it's actually better when it takes some effort, because then it's not just this Shazam and it goes away thing. So I'm for the lifestyle changes to improve brain chemistry as a treatment for depression. However, this is where I stand, is I have had some clients that tried all the lifestyle stuff and were really conscientious about it and still didn't get the improvement. I'm not opposed to medication in cases like that. I think often in life we have two very bad choices in front of us. And I wouldn't even call medication a terrible choice, but often they're less than ideal choices in front of us, and it's just a matter of choosing the best of two imperfect options. We have to be practical. I had one client that, let me just say, he had obsessive thoughts, and he would start believing something and he would become obsessed with it. So one day he was believing that he was a pedophile, and the next day he was believing that he was attracted to his own mother. And he wasn't, those things weren't true, but he would get that in his head and it would start becoming a big thing, and I would have to have 2-3 sessions with him a day, just to stabilize him. Went on an SSRI drug and stopped calling me. It was just over. He was fine. So there are some really strong improvements that some people experience with the medication. For that reason, I'm not closed to that being the best option at times. But I think often we can do more without medication than we try, and I'll be sharing with you everything that I can in those lines. Amen? All right, so I want to close with just a nice kind of little Bible study, guys. We're told that when Jesus came into the garden, he began to be sorrowful and very heavy. Sorrowful and very heavy. Those words are ekthambo and adamanio. And I looked into the words from which they were translated. Ekthambo meant thrown into terror. Thrown into terror. And adamanio meant depression, but there were 3 Greek words that meant depression, and this was the strongest of the 3. So when Jesus came into the garden, he was terrified or anxious and depressed. Do you see that? He was terrified. He was anxious and depressed. He carried our anxiety and our depression all the way through the garden, through the trials, and to a lonely cross where he gave himself up for the sins of the world and experienced such overwhelming grief that it produced physical symptoms in him that ultimately snuffed out his life. That's our Jesus, my brothers and sisters. He has already carried your anxiety and depression all the way to a lonely cross. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. But we esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. Amen? And so Jesus has already carried these things, and as we wrestle with them, we can know that when we go to him with our struggles, we do not get a vacant stare back. Oh, I don't know what anxiety and depression are like. No, he says, I know how you feel. I was God incarnate, my perfect divinity, but encased in fallen humanity, and I know how it feels to be anxious and depressed. And I carried that all for you, so let me work with you now to help resolve it, or help you help other people resolve it. And that's what God is asking of us right now. Amen? Amen. So any questions or comments? Let's see, we have, how much time do we have? Oh, well, sorry. Was I talking that long? Did I start late? Okay. Do you have somewhere to run off to? Yeah. You do? Okay. Questions, comments? We've got little Miss Orange microphone over here. It matches her hippie dress. Isn't that cool? Questions, comments? You okay? Oh, there we go.
One thing that I recently found that was very helpful to stop the recurring negative cycle that for me would happen when I get out of the shower each morning. I would look in the mirror and have a lot of negative self-talk going on, self-defeating type things that I would say to myself. And I started listening to Mel Robbins, and she was kind of like a motivational speaker, and the title of the video was Things to Do Before 9 a.m. And it was basically showing up for yourself. You're kind to other people, be kind to yourself. Yeah. And in the mirror, I mean, you have a lifetime of positive associations to a high five or a thumbs up. Give it to yourself in the mirror. Say, you're going to be okay. You're doing okay. Hang in there. Say something kind to yourself. Because, I mean, sometimes you're just dying inside for that kindness.
And you're so hard on yourself.
Yeah.
We can be, yeah.
And she had a few other little small things that just made a huge difference for me.
Oh, that's great.
Show up for yourself by giving yourself 10 minutes of planning time, 10 minutes of plank time. I can't do that much exercise, but the core of you have to really strain. It relaxes your whole sympathetic system.
You said plank time?
Yeah.
Wait, you did 10 minutes of playing time?
No, plank. P-L-A-N-K.
Playtime.
It's something that people do in the dojo to strengthen the core muscles, and you're basically on your elbows and toes, and you hold yourself there, and to make it difficult, you can lift one leg up and down.
Well, let's just start with the regular one first.
Yeah. Anyway.
But you're saying that improves, it strengthens your core, and then that
it helps to
stabilize.
reduce the anxiety.
Isn't that interesting? I didn't know
because
that.
you're more in your body.
Oh, wow.
You know, you can do any type of exercise for 10 minutes.
That's such a cool hack.
But then you make your bed, because it's a small thing, but you can show yourself that you're important, and when you go to bed, it will be nice and made for you.
That's right.
It's a little just sign of success that will boost you to the next thing.
Well, and also you're caring for yourself, which, a lot of people with depression really neglect themselves abnormally. So you're going across that. You're doing
And there was one more thing that helped me also, and that's to brush your teeth with a non-dominant hand, very slowly, being thankful. Tell God in your mind all the things that you are thankful for.
Oh, I love that. Those are some cool hacks. Thank you. Excellent. Okay, you take over.
So let's give Jennifer a hand, first of all.
Thank you. Welcome. Give yourself a hand.
Who learned something helpful today from that? Yeah, I did too. How many of you